What is up, YouTube? While we wait on Stephanie to come back, sheriff affair with a 17-year-old black teen girl leads to pregnancy and grizzly murder. What? Oh my gracious! Y'all hit that subscribe button, man. Hit that bell. That's a long video, so let's check.
In every town, there's always someone you trust without question, a figure of authority, someone you believe will always do what's right. But what happens when that trust is misplaced? What happens when the line between protector and predator is crossed?
Can't see the video.
In this quiet, familiar community, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Children played in the streets, neighbors exchanged friendly waves, and life moved at its usual pace. But beneath the surface of routine life, something was unfolding, something that would leave the town reeling. What do you do when the person everyone looks up to, the one sworn to serve and protect, has something to hide? At first, nothing seemed out of place. He was a sheriff, a father, a husband. She was a bright young girl with her whole life ahead of her. Their paths crossed like so many others in this small town. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Conversations that started casually became longer. Private moments, once innocent, turned into something much more complicated. And before anyone knew it, the line had been crossed, a line that could never be uncrossed. How does a community come to terms with the realization that the person they trusted the most is capable of the unimaginable? Some say every crime leaves a trail, no matter how carefully it's covered. But what happens when the one leading the search is the very person who knows exactly where that trail ends? Sheriff Clayton Marshall was more than just a man in uniform. He was the foundation of this town, trusted by neighbors, respected by colleagues, and admired by his family. To most, Clayton was a man who balanced the pressures of law enforcement with the responsibilities of being a husband and father. Married to Sharon, with 2 daughters, he lived the life others aspired to, seamlessly juggling work and family. His younger daughter, Ella, adored him. To Ella, her father wasn't just the sheriff. He was her hero, the rock of their family. Clayton's second daughter had a best friend, Monique Ellis. Monique had spent much of her childhood in the Marshall household. She and Ella were inseparable, the kind of friends who didn't knock before entering each other's homes. Monique was practically family. Their friendship stretched back as far as anyone could remember, from playing in the backyard as toddlers to late-night study sessions in high school. Wherever Ella was, Monique wasn't far behind. But Monique wasn't just Ella's best friend. She was the daughter of Officer Jerome Ellis, a deputy who had served under Clayton for years. Jerome and Clayton shared more than a professional relationship. They were close friends. They had celebrated holidays together, attended family gatherings, and stood by each other through life's ups and downs. Monique's presence in Clayton's life was as constant as the ticking of a clock, something that never required a second thought. She was just always there. The bond between these families was built over years, strengthened by trust and shared memories. Clayton remembered the day Monique was born as if it were yesterday. He had been at the hospital, holding her tiny body in his arms, promising Jerome that he would always be there for her. Over the years, their lives intertwined naturally. There were neighborhood barbecues where Monique sat on Clayton's shoulders, summer vacations where the Ellis and Marshall families laughed together, and Christmas mornings spent exchanging gifts. Monique was there for everything: birthdays, recitals, and lazy Sunday afternoons in the Marshall living room. Her connection to Clayton was deep and unquestioned. To Monique, Clayton was Ella's father, a second father figure in her life, someone she could trust completely. She never thought twice about being in his presence, whether it was in his home, at family events, or passing by his office after school. But now, Monique was 17. No longer the little girl Clayton had once carried on his shoulders. She was stepping into adulthood with dreams of becoming someone important. someone who would one day wear a badge of her own.
Mm.
Monique had ambition, the kind that could fill a room with energy. She wanted to join one of the top security agencies in the country. Maybe the FBI, maybe the Secret Service. She had goals, and she knew what she wanted. Their lives, once connected through friendship and family, now stood on the edge of a shift neither of them could see coming. Clayton saw her more frequently now, not just as Ella's best friend, but as someone with whom he crossed paths regularly. She was in his house almost every weekend. They saw each other at family parties and school events. And occasionally, Monique stopped by the sheriff's office to meet her father, waiting in the lobby or wandering the halls. She was always around, always present in the background of Clayton's life. And with each passing day, their paths became just a little more entangled. It started like any other day, one that should have slipped into the routine rhythm of life. But some moments have a way of shifting everything, and this one would be no different. Monique Ellis hadn't planned on staying long at the sheriff's station. She had only stopped by to meet her father, Officer Jerome Ellis, hoping for a quick hello and a ride home. It was something she had done countless times before. Waiting in the familiar halls, surrounded by the hum of conversations and the occasional ring of phones. It was ordinary, uneventful. But on this particular afternoon, the air felt different. Clayton Marshall spotted her from his office window as she entered the station, her presence catching his eye in a way it never had before. She wasn't the same girl he remembered. A shadow of adolescence had given way to the undeniable form of a young woman. There was a grace in the way she moved now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Clayton told himself it was nothing, just an observation. But the thought lingered longer than it should have. He knew Monique well. Too well, in fact. He had watched her grow up, laughed at her childhood antics, and celebrated her achievements alongside his daughter Ella. But today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, something stirred inside him. A shift he didn't want to acknowledge. He tried to shake it off, tried to remind himself of who she was, who he was. But the more he watched her, the more difficult it became to look away. She wasn't just Monique, the little girl from the backyard birthday parties. She was someone else now, someone he found himself noticing in ways he shouldn't. The moment of recognition unsettled him, like a sudden misstep on familiar ground. Guilt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, whispering that this was wrong, that he needed to stop. But temptation has a way of creeping in, winding its way through cracks in even the most disciplined mind. And as much as he fought to push it away, it clung to him, persistent and unwelcome. When Monique made her way down the hall toward her father's desk, Clayton stepped out of his office almost instinctively. He knew Jerome was out on assignment. He had sent him out earlier himself. There was no one else for Monique to meet, no one else for her to sit with. And in that moment, Clayton saw an opportunity, a way to prolong this encounter, to explore a curiosity he didn't want to admit he felt. "Monique!" he called out, his voice casual, almost fatherly. "Your dad's not back yet. Why don't you come wait in my office?" There was nothing in his tone to suggest anything unusual, no reason for Monique to feel uneasy. She smiled easily, trusting him completely. He was, after all, her father's closest friend, someone she had known her entire life. She followed him without hesitation, walking into the office that she had seen so many times before. Clayton offered her a seat by the window, watching as she settled in. She glanced around the room, her eyes catching on the artifacts and photographs scattered across the shelves. Mementos from years in law enforcement, framed commendations, and keepsakes from old cases. The room, much like the man himself, seemed steeped in experience and authority. Monique admired it all with a kind of wonder, unaware of the thoughts unraveling in Clayton's mind. He tried to act normal, tried to remind himself that this was just another conversation, just another day. But as he sat down across from her, something inside him refused to quiet down. She wasn't just a visitor in his office. She was a young woman sitting within arm's reach, someone who, for the first time in years, made him feel something unexpected. He asked her about school, an easy topic, familiar territory, and Monique, comfortable in his presence, responded eagerly. She spoke about her classes, her friends, and the future she envisioned for herself. "I've been thinking about going into law enforcement," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Maybe the detectives, or even the Secret Service. Something that matters." Clayton listened, his attention fully on her now. There was an earnestness in her words, a spark of ambition that reminded him of his own younger days. And in that moment, he saw an opportunity, a chance to offer guidance, to position himself as someone who could help shape her future. The idea came to him unbidden, a way to extend their conversations beyond this office, to make sure these moments between them didn't end here. "You know," Clayton said slowly, "I have some friends in those agencies. I could put in a good word for you, maybe even help you get some hands-on experience." Monique's face lit up at the offer. "Really? You'd do that for me?" He smiled, playing the part of the mentor she believed him to be. "Of course, but there's a lot to learn before you get there. It's not an easy path, and you'll need to work hard. If you want, I could help you prepare." There was nothing in his voice that suggested anything other than genuine kindness, and Monique, eager to succeed, accepted the offer without hesitation. She didn't question his motives. Why would she? To her, this was just an older, experienced man offering her guidance, someone she trusted implicitly. Clayton leaned back in his chair, satisfied with how easily the conversation had flowed, how naturally he had planted the seeds for future encounters. He told himself this was harmless, that he was only helping a young woman reach her goals. But deep down, he knew better. He knew that every word he had spoken, every promise he had made, was part of something much more complicated. As Monique sat across from him, excited about the opportunities ahead, Clayton allowed himself a moment to revel in the power he held. The power to shape her dreams, to guide her path, and if he chose, to take these meetings further than she could ever imagine. And in that moment, a road of no return had been crossed, one that could never be undone. Opportunities can feel like lifelines, especially when they come from someone you trust. For Monique, Clayton's offer of mentorship felt like a step toward everything she had dreamed of, a rare chance to get ahead in a competitive field, guided by someone with experience, influence, and connections. But what she couldn't see, what no one saw, was how easily a dream can become a trap in the hands of the wrong person. Clayton's proposal was simple. A few private sessions, just the two of them, focused on preparing Monique for the world of national security. He framed it as career advice, a way to give her the edge she needed to succeed. At first, Monique felt nothing but gratitude. After all, how many young women her age got this kind of attention from someone in a position of power? He assured her that his guidance would set her apart from the crowd, opening doors she hadn't even imagined yet. But Clayton was careful, too careful. With every word, every suggestion, he planted little doubts in Monique's mind. He warned her not to tell too many people about their sessions, claiming they wouldn't understand her ambition. "People might try to hold you back," he said. "They might tell you it's impossible, that you're aiming too high. The fewer people know, the better. It's safer that way." At first it made sense to Monique. She'd heard the doubts from others before. How young women, especially women like her, shouldn't aim too high. Clayton's warning felt protective, even wise. She didn't question it. Why would she? He was only looking out for her, or so she thought. The sessions began innocently enough. Conversations about the challenges of law enforcement, the importance of resilience, and the skills she'd need to thrive in high-pressure environments. They met after school hours, at first in Clayton's office, then later at more private locations under the pretense of focused training. He always made her feel special, like she was receiving something no one else could offer her. And Monique, eager to impress, gave the sessions her all, believing they were shaping her future. But slowly, the nature of these meetings began to change. What started as professional guidance became something more personal, more intimate. Clayton started asking her about her life outside of school, her fears, her hopes, her relationships. He blurred the line between mentor and confidant, weaving himself deeper into her life without her realizing it. He was patient, calculating. He didn't rush things. He let Monique come to him, allowed her to trust him completely. Every time she opened up, every time she leaned on him for advice, the grip he had on her life tightened. And Monique, caught in the glow of his attention, never saw it for what it was. She believed she was being guided, not manipulated. She believed Clayton was helping her, not grooming her. The sessions began to stretch longer into the evenings. Clayton always had a reason to extend them, an important topic they hadn't covered yet, a critical piece of advice that couldn't wait. Soon they were meeting late into the night. The meetings were framed as necessary, essential steps on her journey toward success. If you want to make it, he told her, you have to be willing to put in the extra effort. And Monique, driven by ambition and the desire to please him, agreed without hesitation. She told herself these meetings were part of her growth, that the late hours were a small price to pay for everything Clayton was offering her. But with each session, she found herself more attached to him, not just as a mentor, but as someone she trusted deeply, someone she depended on in ways she couldn't explain. Clayton knew exactly what he was doing. He crafted his words carefully, making her believe that their time together was both a privilege and a secret, something they had to protect from those who might misunderstand. Some people won't see this for what it really is, he told her. They'll think it's inappropriate. They'll try to come between us, tell you to quit, make you give up on your dream. But I know how far you can go, Monique. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Monique believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was the sheriff, her father's trusted friend, the man who had known her all her life. If he said their meetings were necessary, they were. If he said the secrecy was for her benefit, she trusted him. And so she kept quiet, telling no one, not her father, not Ella, not her closest friends, about the time she spent with Clayton. The late-night sessions soon became their own little world, a place where Monique felt both vulnerable and powerful. Clayton made her feel like she was becoming someone important, someone capable of great things. And the more time they spent together, the more she relied on him, not just for guidance, but for emotional support. She saw him as a protector, someone who understood her in ways no one else did. But Clayton's mentorship wasn't just about her future. It was about something selfish. He made sure she needed him, not just for her career, but for her sense of self-worth. With every passing week, Monique found herself more drawn to him, more dependent on his approval. She wasn't just learning from him. She was falling under his spell. Then, one evening, the dynamic shifted completely. They were reviewing case files, discussing real-world examples of high-pressure decision-making, when Clayton's hand lingered just a moment too long on her shoulder. Monique didn't pull away. She didn't know she should. It felt like part of the closeness they had built, a natural extension of the bond they shared. And Clayton, sensing her acceptance, took it as permission to go further. The first kiss came without warning, but it didn't feel forced. It felt inevitable. like a step they had been moving toward all along. Monique, caught in the moment, didn't question it. She had grown used to following Clayton's lead, trusting his guidance. If this was part of their connection, then she welcomed it. That night, the bridge between mentor and lover disappeared entirely. What followed was no longer just mentorship. It was a full-fledged affair, hidden behind the same veil of secrecy Clayton had so carefully crafted. Their meetings continued, now infused with a new intensity, a combination of passion and control that left Monique feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable. She was falling deeper, believing that what they shared was real. To Monique, Clayton wasn't just a mentor anymore. He was her guide, her protector, her everything. But Clayton's control over Monique wasn't just emotional. It was absolute. He had woven himself into every aspect of her life, and with every passing day, she depended more on him, trusted him more, and believed that what they had was something worth protecting. And as their affair deepened, the walls around them closed tighter, locking Monique into a world she didn't realize was built on manipulation and deceit. There was no turning back now. Clayton had her exactly where he wanted, completely under his control, and hopelessly in love. Secrets have a way of changing people, of creeping into the small spaces of life and shifting everything just slightly out of place. At first, the changes are subtle, hardly noticeable. But as time goes on, the weight of those hidden truths begins to show. For Monique, the affair with Clayton had become the center of her world. Where once she had been open, bubbly, and connected to those closest to her, she now began to pull away. Slowly but surely, the Monique everyone knew was slipping into the shadows. Calls from friends went unanswered, hangouts with Ella became fewer and further between, and conversations with her father, Jerome, grew shorter by the day. Where once she had shared everything with him, the small victories, the daily frustrations, now she gave him little more than one-word answers and excuses. Jerome could feel the distance growing, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly why. He had always been close to Monique. They had shared a bond that most fathers would envy. But now, every attempt to connect seemed to be met with a wall. She was always busy, always tired, always distracted. He tried to brush it off at first. Teenagers go through phases, he told himself. Maybe it was the stress of school, the pressure of thinking about her future. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore. There was a shift in her demeanor, something that felt out of character. The Monique he knew didn't keep secrets from him. But now, it felt as if she were carrying something heavy, something she wasn't willing to share. Jerome wasn't the type to let things slide for long. One evening, he found his chance to confront her. She had come home late, her expression distant, as if her mind were somewhere else entirely. He waited until she was in the kitchen, putting her things down, before stepping in. "Monique," he said, keeping his tone steady. "We need to talk." Monique looked up, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with a smile. "What's up, Dad?" she asked, her voice casual, but Jerome could hear the tension beneath it. "I've noticed you've been distant lately," Jerome said carefully. "You're not around as much. You're not talking to me like you used to. What's going on?" For a moment, Monique seemed caught off guard, as if she hadn't expected him to notice. But then she smiled again, this time more forced. "It's nothing, Dad. Just school, you know. A lot on my plate." Jerome wasn't convinced. Something was off, and no matter how hard she tried to act normal, he could feel the distance between them growing. He pressed her gently, asking if there was anything she needed to talk about, anything that might be bothering her. But Monique was ready for the questions. She had learned from Clayton how to dodge, how to deflect, how to steer conversations away from dangerous territory without raising too much suspicion. "I'm fine," she insisted, her voice just a little too cheerful. "Really, Dad, you don't have to worry about me." Jerome wanted to believe her, wanted to take her words at face value. But a knot of unease settled in his gut, one that he couldn't quite shake. Meanwhile, Clayton was carefully managing the changes in his own life. Sharon, his wife, had begun to sense that something was different. After years of marriage, she knew Clayton better than anyone. And lately, there were small things, things that didn't add up. He had always been a man of routine, steady, predictable, reliable. But now there were moments when he seemed distant, distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. He came home later than usual, offering vague explanations about long shifts or unexpected meetings. And when he was home, there was a restlessness about him, an unease that Sharon hadn't seen before. She asked him about it, of course, small, subtle questions, not wanting to seem accusatory. "Everything okay at work?" she would ask as they sat down for dinner. Or, "You seem a little off lately. Is something bothering you?" Clayton was ready for the questions. He knew how to lie without making it obvious, how to offer just enough truth to satisfy her without giving anything away. "It's just work," he would say, his tone light, but not too light. "You know how things get this time of year." And Sharon, though still unsettled, would let it go, for a while at least. But the nagging feeling didn't go away. She noticed the small things, how he checked his phone more often, how he seemed unusually guarded about where he was going or what he was doing. There were nights when he came to bed long after she had fallen asleep, and mornings when he left the house earlier than usual, always with an excuse at the ready. Sharon told herself she was probably overthinking things. Clayton was the sheriff, after all. His job came with its fair share of stress and responsibility. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about work. Something had changed. She just couldn't figure out what. The tension in the Marshall household was little at first, barely noticeable. But it grew with each passing day, like a splinter buried beneath the skin, small enough to ignore, but impossible to forget. Clayton was careful, though, careful to never let the cracks show too much, careful to keep the walls of his double life intact. He knew how to say the right things, how to offer just enough affection to keep suspicion at bay. To Sharon, he was still the man she had married, just a little more tired, a little more preoccupied. To his daughters, he was still their father, just a bit more distant than usual. But Clayton knew the truth. He knew that the walls were closing in, slowly but surely, and no matter how carefully he managed things, the weight of his secret was beginning to take its toll. Monique, too, was feeling the strain. She missed the simplicity of her old life, missed the ease with which she could talk to her father, missed the carefree laughter she used to share with Ella. But every time she thought about stepping back, about pulling away from Clayton, she felt the invisible chains tighten around her. He had become more than just a mentor, more than just a lover. He had become the center of her world. And even as she felt the distance growing between herself and the people she loved, she told herself it was worth it. Clayton had promised her a future, had made her believe that what they shared was special. She couldn't walk away now, not when she had already come so far. And so the distance grew, between Monique and her father, between Clayton and his wife, between who they were and who they had become. The cracks were small, but they were there, waiting, widening, threatening to shatter everything the moment the truth came to light. Secrets have a way of unraveling at the worst possible moment. What begins quietly hidden in the corners of stolen time, can grow into something that demands to be seen, no matter how carefully it's concealed. And for Clayton and Monique, the moment they feared, the moment they never thought would arrive, was finally here. Monique had known something was wrong for a few weeks. At first, she ignored it, convincing herself that stress or exhaustion was to blame. But as the days passed, the signs became impossible to dismiss. The nausea in the mornings, the sudden fatigue, the gnawing feeling that something had changed within her. Eventually, she bought a pregnancy test, hoping, praying, that it was just her imagination. But when the 2 lines appeared, confirming her worst fear, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. She stared at the test in disbelief, her heart racing as 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. She wasn't prepared for this. She hadn't planned for this. And yet, there it was. The undeniable proof that life, in all its chaotic unpredictability, had taken a turn she never saw coming. She sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of the realization settling heavily on her chest. And in that silence, only one thought stood out clearly. She had to tell Clayton. He had promised to be there for her, to help her build a future. If anyone could help her navigate this, it would be him, wouldn't it? When Monique finally gathered the courage to tell him, it was during one of their late-night meetings. They were sitting together, the air between them thick with the usual mix of tension and intimacy. She knew that once she said the words, everything would change. There would be no going back. "Clayton," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to tell you something." He glanced at her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, leaning in slightly, as if bracing himself for what was coming. Monique hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. And then she said it, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Clayton stared at her, his expression frozen in disbelief. The words hung in the air like a ticking bomb, each second stretching into an eternity. Panic hit him like a tidal wave. His mind raced through the implications, what this meant for his career, his family, his reputation. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now hanging by a thread. If anyone found out, if his wife, his daughters, the town, or the department discovered the truth, his life would be over. Clayton felt the walls closing in around him, the weight of his double life crushing him from all sides. He needed a solution, something quick, something final. This couldn't get out. It wouldn't get out. "We can't do this," he said, his voice sharp, almost panicked. "This can't happen. No one can know." Monique stared at him, confusion and hurt flickering across her face. "What do you mean? We can figure this out. You said you'd always be there for me." Clayton ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. He couldn't afford this scandal. He couldn't afford the fallout. In his panic, a single thought emerged. There was still time to fix this. There was still time to make it go away. He leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "You need to get rid of it, Monique. We have to end this before it's too late." Monique's heart sank at his words, disbelief washing over her. She had come to him for support, for reassurance, but instead she was met with fear and rejection. "You're asking me to have an abortion," she whispered, her voice cracking. Clayton nodded, desperation etched across his face. "It's the only way," he insisted. "If anyone finds out, my wife, your father, everything will be ruined. We can't let that happen. Please, Monique, you have to do this." But Monique shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she said firmly. "I won't do that. This is our child, Clayton. You told me we were in this together. You promised." For the first time, Clayton realized that Monique believed in the fantasy he had spun around her, that their relationship was real, that they had a future together, and in that moment he saw the full weight of his manipulation. She wasn't just carrying his child. She was carrying all the promises he had made to her, all the lies he had fed her to keep her close. Clayton's panic deepened. He tried to reason with her, to make her see the danger they were in. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "If this gets out, my career is over. My family, my life, everything will be destroyed. We can't let that happen, Monique. You have to do this." But Monique was resolute. She shook her head again, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. "I won't do it," she said softly but firmly. "I won't get rid of it. This is my child, and I won't let you make me feel ashamed for wanting to keep it." Clayton felt the ground slipping from beneath him, his control over the situation unraveling with every word she spoke. He had built his entire life on maintaining control over his career, his family, his relationships. And now, in the face of Monique's quiet defiance, that control was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in his life, Clayton Marshall, the man everyone saw as steady, composed and in control, felt powerless, and that terrified him. He tried one last time, his voice breaking under the weight of his desperation. "Please, Monique," he whispered. "If you care about me, if you care about what we have, you'll do this. You'll end it before it's too late." But Monique's resolve didn't waver. She looked him in the eye, her voice unwavering. "No," she said simply. "I'm keeping it." And in that moment, Clayton knew that the life he had so carefully built, the life he had fought so hard to protect, was on the verge of collapsing around him. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and no matter how hard Clayton tried to control the narrative, the consequences of his choices were closing in. The question wasn't whether the truth would come to light. It was how much damage it would leave in its wake. There comes a point where fear consumes everything. Logic fades, morality crumbles, and all that remains is the instinct to survive, no matter the cost. For Clayton, that moment had arrived. With every passing day, the walls of his carefully curated life were closing in, and the truth loomed like a shadow waiting to swallow him whole. The pregnancy was a threat Clayton couldn't escape. No amount of lies or persuasion had worked. Monique had made it clear she wasn't going to terminate the pregnancy. And with that decision, Clayton's world tilted on its axis. His career, his marriage, his reputation, everything was now on the brink of collapse. If the truth came out, there would be no redemption, no way to fix the wreckage it would leave behind. He spent restless nights staring at the ceiling, calculating every possible outcome. Each scenario ended the same way: scandal, disgrace, ruin. His name would be dragged through the mud. The sheriff's office would crumble under the weight of public outrage. His wife, Sharon, would leave him, his daughters would disown him, and the town that once respected him would turn against him with fury. He saw no way out, no way to contain the damage. But then, a thought crept in. A thought that should have horrified him, but instead brought a twisted sense of clarity. There was one way, one final way to make sure the truth never saw the light of day. He told himself it was the only solution, the only way to protect everything he had worked for. He knew it was wrong, knew that crossing this line would be a point of no return. But in his mind, the choice wasn't between right and wrong anymore. It was between survival and destruction. The plan formed slowly, taking shape in the dark corners of his mind. If Monique was gone, if she simply disappeared, no one would ever know. There would be questions, of course, but questions could be managed. He was the sheriff, after all. He had experience in controlling investigations, in steering them away from inconvenient truths. He could make it look like she had vanished on her own. He could make sure that no one ever connected the dots. Clayton waited until the time was right. He reached out to Monique, his voice calm and reassuring as he invited her to dinner at a secluded location. Just the two of them. He framed it as a way to talk about the future, to make plans for the baby, to figure out how they could navigate the situation together. And Monique, despite everything, still believed in him. She wanted to believe that they could make things work, that Clayton would stand by her like he had promised. She arrived at the location, a small cabin on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Clayton greeted her with the same familiar smile, the same comforting presence that had drawn her in from the beginning. He had prepared everything meticulously. A quiet dinner, just the two of them, with wine poured into delicate glasses and a warm fire crackling in the hearth. They talked over dinner, their conversation laced with promises and reassurances. Clayton told her everything she wanted to hear, that they would figure it out, that they could still build a future together, that everything would be okay. And for a brief moment, Monique allowed herself to believe him. She let her guard down, feeling the familiar pull of the man she thought she knew. But Clayton's mind was elsewhere, focused on the small vial hidden in his pocket. A vial containing the drug that would ensure Monique never told a soul. He waited for the right moment. Monique was focused on the conversation, unaware of Clayton's growing tension. As she picked at her dinner, Clayton leaned in casually, reaching for her glass. "Let me top that off for you," he offered with an easy smile, lifting the wine bottle before she could respond. She was in her brain having good thoughts of having a baby with the sheriff. With practiced ease, he poured the wine, keeping his other hand steady as he palmed the vial. As the liquid flowed into the glass, he tilted the bottle just slightly, allowing the vial's contents to slip into the wine undetected. No stirring, no swirling. It dissolved seamlessly with the pour, hidden within the rich red. He handed the glass back without missing a beat, his voice smooth and conversational. "This should help us relax a little," he said with a grin, watching as Monique, trusting and oblivious, took a sip, then another, the wine flowing easily as the conversation continued. It didn't take long for the drug to take effect. Monique's eyelids grew heavy, her words slurring as she tried to keep up with the conversation. A wave of confusion washed over her, and she looked at Clayton with a frown, as if trying to make sense of the sudden exhaustion that had overtaken her. "I don't feel so good," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Clayton reached out, his hand resting on hers in a gesture of false comfort. "It's okay," he said softly. "You just need to rest. Everything's going to be fine." Monique's body grew limp, her head lolling to the side as the drug pulled her into unconsciousness. Clayton watched her for a moment, ensuring that the drug had done its job. And then, without a trace of hesitation, he moved to the next phase of his plan. He carried her to his truck, her unconscious form cradled in his arms like a dark echo of the day he had carried her as a baby. But this time, there was no joy, no pride, only cold determination. Clayton drove in silence, the road stretching out before him like a path toward freedom. He had chosen the location carefully, a remote area deep in the woods, far from any trail or road. It was a place no one would stumble upon by accident, a place where secrets could stay buried. The drive was long, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him with every mile. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The moment he had crossed the line, there was no turning back. There was only one way forward now, and he was committed to seeing it through. When he reached the clearing, he stepped out of the truck and looked around, ensuring that they were alone. The forest was silent, the trees standing like silent witnesses to what was about to happen. Clayton opened the door and lifted Monique from the passenger seat, her body still limp and unresponsive. He carried her deep into the woods, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. And then, in that remote, forgotten place, he did what he had convinced himself he had to do. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling only slightly as he placed them over her mouth and nose. Monique stirred briefly, her body reacting instinctively, but the drug had taken too strong a hold. Within moments, the struggle stopped, and the forest fell silent once more. Clayton sat there for a moment, his hands still pressed against her lifeless face, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and then, as if on autopilot, he began to dig. He worked quickly, the dirt flying beneath his hands as he created a shallow grave. Time blurred, the weight of his actions settling like a stone in his chest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop, not now. When the grave was finished, he laid Monique's body inside, covering her with the cold, damp earth. And just like that, she was gone, buried beneath the weight of lies and betrayal. Clayton stood over the grave, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The night was still, the forest holding its breath as if waiting to see what he would do next. But there was nothing left to do. He had made his choice, and now there was only silence. Without a word, Clayton turned and made his way back to the truck, leaving no trace of what had transpired. The forest would keep his secret, and with it, the life he had been so desperate to protect. But some secrets refuse to stay buried. When someone goes missing in a close-knit town, it sends shockwaves through every corner of the community. People rally together, neighbors exchange worried glances, and families cling tighter to each other, hoping it never happens to them. But this time, the missing person wasn't just anyone. This was Monique Ellis, the daughter of a beloved officer, a girl everyone knew and adored. The day Monique didn't come home, panic began to spread. Her parents, Jerome and Denise Ellis, went from thinking she was running late to realizing something was very, very wrong. They tried her phone. No answer. They called her friends. None of them had seen her. And when the hours ticked by with no sign of Monique, the fear set in like a cold wave, crashing over them. Jerome knew something was off. His gut twisted with a father's instinct, that nagging feeling he couldn't shake. Monique wasn't the type to vanish without a word, without letting someone know where she was. And as the sun set on that first day without her, Jerome did the only thing he could. He called in a missing persons report. The sheriff's office sprang into action, or so it looked. Leading the search was none other than Clayton Marshall, the man who had every reason to make sure Monique was never found. Clayton wore the mask of professionalism perfectly, his voice steady, his demeanor calm, as he promised the community that he would do everything in his power to bring Monique home. But every step Clayton took was calculated. Every lead followed, every search organized, was done with one goal in mind: to keep the truth buried, along with Monique. The search started immediately, with deputies canvassing the town, questioning anyone who might have seen her. Clayton ensured that every effort looked genuine. Teams scouring parks, abandoned buildings, and back roads. He was there every step of the way, barking orders, comforting volunteers, and appearing to go above and beyond. To everyone else, he looked like a man determined to find the missing girl. But in reality, Clayton was always 2 steps ahead, steering the investigation away from the one place they'd never look, the remote spot where Monique's body lay hidden beneath the cold earth. Jerome, desperate for answers, leaned heavily on Clayton, his longtime friend and mentor. Clayton played the part well, offering words of comfort and support. his arms slung around Jerome's shoulders as they combed through the possibilities. "We'll find her, Jerome," he said more than once, his voice steady and reassuring. "I promise you, we'll bring her home." Each time Jerome's hope wavered, Clayton was there to catch him. He stayed close to the family, visiting their home often, sitting at their kitchen table and holding Denise's hand while she wept. He became their lifeline in the chaos, the one person they felt they could rely on when everything else was falling apart.
This is so crazy.
And that was exactly how Clayton wanted it. But Clayton's grip on the investigation was tight. He carefully controlled the narrative, guiding deputies and volunteers toward false leads. He suggested that Monique might have left town on her own, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of school and life. He floated the idea that she might be staying with a friend who hadn't come forward yet, or even that she might have been picked up by someone she knew. His theories planted seeds of doubt, redirecting the search toward meaningless trails that led nowhere. Clayton knew how to manipulate the emotions of those around him, playing the role of the concerned sheriff while subtly pushing the investigation further from the truth. Every time the search teams got close to an area he feared they might uncover, Clayton conveniently found a new lead. A sighting that needed to be checked out on the other side of town, a tip that required immediate attention elsewhere. He kept everyone moving, always one step behind where they needed to be, ensuring that no one ever came close to the grave where Monique's body rested. Meanwhile, Monique's parents clung to every word Clayton said, believing that he was doing everything in his power to find their daughter. Jerome, especially, relied on Clayton more than anyone else. As a father and an officer, Jerome felt helpless in the face of his daughter's disappearance. But with Clayton leading the charge, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that if anyone could bring Monique back, it was the man he had trusted for so many years. Clayton knew exactly how to manipulate that trust, using it to keep Jerome close while keeping the truth at bay. He made sure to include Jerome in every step of the investigation, giving him just enough responsibility to feel involved, but never enough to uncover the truth. And when Jerome's frustration boiled over, Clayton was there to absorb it, to let him vent his anger without raising suspicion. "I should have been there," Jerome said more than once, guilt and grief thick in his voice. "I should have protected her." Clayton would shake his head, his expression solemn. "This isn't your fault, Jerome. We'll find her. I promise you, we'll find her." It was the perfect manipulation, a delicate balance of comfort and control, of empathy and deceit. Clayton gave the Ellises just enough hope to keep them going, just enough reassurance to prevent them from looking too closely at the gaps in the investigation. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Monique. The community grew restless, rumors spreading like wildfire, theories whispered in hushed tones. Some believed she had run away. Others feared something worse. But through it all, Clayton remained a steady presence, the man everyone looked to for answers. Behind the scenes, however, the weight of his actions was beginning to take its toll. Each day the investigation dragged on was a reminder of the terrible truth he was hiding. And though he wore the mask of the concerned sheriff well, there were moments when the cracks began to show. Moments when the guilt gnawed at the edges of his mind, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed lie he had built. But Clayton couldn't afford to falter. The moment he slipped, the moment he let his guard down, everything would come crashing down around him. So he kept moving, kept directing the search, kept feeding Jerome and Denise just enough hope to keep them from giving up. He knew that time was on his side. The longer the search went on without results, the more people would begin to believe that Monique was gone for good. And if the investigation dragged on long enough, eventually it would fade into the background. Just another unsolved case, another tragedy with no answers. That was the hope Clayton clung to, that the search would fizzle out, that the town would move on, and that his secret would remain buried where no one would ever find it. But secrets have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply they're buried. And as the days passed, the pressure on Clayton grew heavier, the cracks in his carefully controlled world spreading wider with each passing moment. The investigation he had worked so hard to control was slipping further from his grasp, and the harder he tried to keep it contained, the more fragile it became. But for now, Clayton remained in control, barely. He kept the investigation alive just enough to maintain appearances, kept Jerome close enough to keep him from looking elsewhere, and kept the truth buried beneath layers of lies and false leads. But Clayton knew deep down that this fragile charade couldn't last forever. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and when it finally came to light, it would tear through everything in its path. Time has a way of dulling memories and softening the sharp edges of grief, but not for everyone. 5 months after Monique's disappearance, the town had begun to settle back into its routine, as people do after a tragedy. Life moved on, though her absence lingered in quiet moments, and her name remained on the lips of those who still hoped for answers. But as the days stretched into months, even hope began to fade. It was becoming another cold case, one of those unsolved tragedies that leave behind more questions than answers. The search parties had slowed, the posters plastered on storefronts had started to peel, and the once constant buzz of speculation had quieted to murmurs. It seemed, at least to some, that Monique had simply vanished without a trace, and Clayton Marshall believed that, with time, the truth would remain buried, just like Monique. But then, as it often does in stories like these, the truth began to surface, unexpectedly, and from the most unlikely place. The truth doesn't stay buried forever, no matter how deep someone tries to hide it. It wasn't hackers or investigators who uncovered the first cracks in Clayton Marshall's web of lies. It was 2 ordinary hikers, out for what should have been a peaceful day on the trails. They had no idea that what lay ahead would unravel a mystery that had haunted the town for months. The hikers, a couple in their late 20s, had ventured deep into a forested area rarely visited by anyone other than wildlife enthusiasts. The trail was rough and winding, twisting through dense woods where silence reigned, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. It was the kind of place where no one would expect to find anything but nature, much less a hidden secret. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows along the trail, they noticed something strange, an unnatural disturbance in the ground just off the path. A patch of earth, uneven and slightly sunken, stood out from the rest of the forest floor. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. It could have been nothing, a buried animal maybe, but something about it felt off. Their curiosity got the better of them. With hesitant steps, they approached the disturbed ground. As one of them knelt down to inspect it more closely, they noticed something chilling. What looked like a corner of fabric, barely visible beneath the dirt and fallen leaves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a shiver down their spines. They knew better than to disturb the site any further. Instead, they marked the location with their GPS and quickly made their way back to the nearest ranger station, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The rangers, alerted by the hikers' discovery, contacted local authorities, and within hours, a full investigative team was on site. What they found beneath the disturbed ground confirmed the hikers' worst fears. Monique Ellis's body, wrapped carefully in a tarp, lay in a shallow grave. Her remains told a silent, heartbreaking story of betrayal and violence. But the discovery didn't just reveal the location of her body. It raised more questions than it answered. How had Monique ended up here? And more importantly, who had put her there? As the forensic team worked methodically at the scene, law enforcement officers scoured the surrounding area for clues. And it was there, among the dirt and foliage, that they found the first piece of undeniable evidence, a small vial, half buried in the earth, bearing the faint imprint of a fingerprint. It was a clue, seemingly insignificant at first glance, but one that would later prove vital to the investigation. With Monique's body recovered, the case that had grown cold suddenly reignited. The detectives took over the investigation, determined to piece together the truth behind her disappearance. They combed through GPS data from Monique's phone, tracing her movements from the night she disappeared. And what they found began to unravel the carefully crafted lies Clayton had spun. The data showed a troubling pattern. Monique's phone had pinged from several locations far from where Clayton claimed she had last been seen. Among them was a remote gas station just outside of town, a seemingly unremarkable stop that would become a critical piece of evidence in the case. When the detectives obtained surveillance footage from the gas station, the full scope of Clayton's deception came into focus. The grainy video, recorded on the same night Monique vanished, showed Clayton's truck pulling into the parking lot. His expression was tight, his eyes scanning the area as if checking for any unwanted attention. And in the passenger seat, slumped and unmoving, was Monique. Her head rested against the window, her body limp, as Clayton stepped out of the vehicle and glanced around the lot. He went inside briefly, emerging moments later and casting another glance toward Monique's lifeless form before getting back into the driver's seat. With a quick look over his shoulder, Clayton drove off into the night, the truck disappearing from the frame, and until now, from the town's collective memory. The video was damning, not just because it placed Clayton with Monique on the night she vanished, but because of the state she was in, unconscious, vulnerable, and in the company of the very man sworn to protect her. The footage raised immediate questions. Why had Clayton never mentioned being with Monique that night? Why had he failed to report their encounter in his official statements? And what had really happened after they left the gas station? With Monique's movements traced to the burial site and surveillance footage tying Clayton to her final hours, the detectives knew they were closing in on the truth. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed hard evidence. And the key to unlocking that evidence lay in the digital breadcrumbs Monique's phone had left behind. The GPS data from Clayton's truck, pulled from onboard tracking systems, provided the final piece of the puzzle. The logs confirmed what the surveillance footage had suggested. Clayton's truck had travelled from the gas station to the remote area where Monique's body was found, matching the exact location marked by the hikers. Every turn, every stop was accounted for, painting a chilling picture of premeditation and cover-up. It was a trail Clayton hadn't expected anyone to follow. But no matter how carefully he had tried to conceal his actions, the truth had found a way to the surface. First through the hikers on the trail, then through the relentless work of investigators, determined to uncover the lies hidden beneath the surface. The discovery of Monique's body wasn't just the end of a search. It was the beginning of justice. And the hikers, unaware of the storm their quiet walk in the woods would unleash, had unknowingly uncovered the secret Clayton Marshall had buried, both literally and figuratively. As the investigation gained momentum, the truth about Clayton's betrayal spread through the town like wildfire. His carefully crafted facade of authority crumbled beneath the weight of the evidence, and with each new discovery, the community began to understand the depth of his deception and the price Monique had paid for his abuse of power. The hikers' discovery on that remote trail would become the turning point in a case that had gone cold for far too long. And as the town braced for the storm that was about to follow, one thing was certain. No secret, no matter how deeply buried, could stay hidden forever. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the quiet office as they locked around his wrists, cold metal biting into his skin. Clayton said nothing. The fight drained from him as the weight of his actions settled like a stone in his chest. There was no more running, no more lying. The truth had caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The agents guided him out of the office, past the deputies who had once respected him, past the desks where he had commanded authority. Now, they looked at him not as their sheriff, but as the man who had betrayed everything the badge stood for. Whispers followed him down the hall, the weight of their judgment heavy on his shoulders. As the agents escorted Clayton to the waiting car, the sun rose high in the sky, casting harsh light on the day of reckoning. The truth, once buried beneath lies and manipulation, had finally come to the surface. And with it, Clayton Marshall's life, as he knew it, was over. The man who had spent his life serving justice was now bound by the same system he had once controlled, a prisoner of his own sins. And as the car doors slammed shut, the message was clear. No one, not even the sheriff, is above the law. Grief by itself is unbearable, but discovering the full extent of a tragedy brings a pain few can describe. When the detectives recovered Monique Ellis's body, the nightmare deepened with every revelation that followed. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, the horrific murder, or the loss of a young life. The autopsy revealed a final, devastating truth that shattered what little remained of her family's world. The forensic team confirmed that Monique had been in the early stages of pregnancy. The child she had carried, Clayton Marshall's child, had been growing inside her when her life was violently taken. That discovery turned the grief of her parents, Jerome and Denise Ellis, into something unbearable. They weren't just mourning their daughter. They were mourning the grandchild they would never meet. It was a loss layered with betrayal, violation, and unspoken dreams. Jerome could barely process the news. His hands shook when the detectives informed him of the pregnancy. It was more than he could bear. The knowledge that his own daughter had carried a child, only to be silenced by a man he trusted. A man who had sat at his kitchen table and offered him comfort as they searched for her. The weight of that betrayal pressed down on Jerome's chest, suffocating him with a guilt he couldn't shake. How had he missed the signs? How could he have stood beside Clayton, searching for his daughter, while the man responsible led them astray? And the pregnancy. He hadn't even known she was in a relationship, let alone involved with a man like Clayton. It was too much. The betrayal came at him in layers, peeling back everything he thought he knew, leaving him raw and exposed. Denise Ellis, already buried under the weight of her grief, fell into complete despair when the autopsy results were revealed. The child would have been her first grandchild, a new beginning, a reason to hope. And now, both Monique and the unborn child were gone, buried together under a blanket of lies and deception. There were no words that could ease the pain of such a loss. Every dream Denise had for her daughter's future was gone, wiped away in the cruelest way possible. The autopsy findings ignited a new wave of outrage within the community. News of Monique's pregnancy spread quickly, turning an already horrific crime into something even more unthinkable. Clayton Marshall wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator who had exploited his position of power, manipulated a young girl, and taken 2 lives to cover his tracks. The man who had once been the community's protector now stood as a symbol of everything they despised. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office and the courthouse, their voices echoing through the streets. Signs demanding justice for Monique and baby waved in the air, and the calls for Clayton's conviction grew louder by the day. The community, once proud of its sheriff, now viewed him as a monster in uniform. Every kind gesture, every award he had received, felt like a mockery of the evil he had hidden beneath his badge. In the Marshall household, the revelations were equally devastating. Sharon Marshall sat in stunned silence as the news unfolded. her world collapsing under the weight of her husband's lies. She had been blindsided by the affair, shattered by the murder. But the pregnancy? That was the final blow, the one truth she couldn't comprehend. Yeah, she thought back to every moment she had shared with Clayton, every day he had spent with their daughters, knowing now that he had carried this unspeakable secret the entire time. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the knowledge that her husband had fathered a child with Monique, a girl they had watched grow up, a friend to their own daughter. The sheer cruelty of it left her speechless. Ella Marshall, Clayton's youngest daughter and Monique's best friend, was broken by the news. She had spent weeks mourning Monique, trying to understand how her father could be involved in such a crime. But learning about the pregnancy was too much to bear. Monique had been carrying her half-sibling, and now both were gone, taken by the man she once called Dad. It was a betrayal so profound that Ella didn't know how to process it. Ella retreated into herself, shutting out the world. She refused to speak to her father, wouldn't even acknowledge his existence. The idea of him disgusted her. Every memory they had shared, the moments she once cherished, were now tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. She felt as though her entire life had been built on lies, and the weight of that realization crushed her. Harper, Clayton's older daughter, responded with anger. She had always been closer to her father, had looked up to him as a role model, only to discover that he had committed unspeakable acts against someone she had grown up with. The pregnancy was the final straw. Harper packed her things and left the house, cutting all ties with her father, unable to forgive him for the lives he had destroyed. The Marshall home, once filled with laughter and routine, became a silent war zone. Sharon tried to hold her daughters together, but there was no repairing the damage Clayton had done. Their family was broken beyond repair, fractured by the weight of his betrayal. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt still, Sharon sat alone, grappling with the reality that the man she had loved for decades was capable of such monstrous acts. The community's anger burned hotter with every passing day. Monique had been one of their own, bright, ambitious, and full of potential. And now, both she and her unborn child were gone, victims of a man they had once trusted. The demand for justice was relentless. They wanted to see Clayton punished, not just for Monique's death, but for the life of the child she carried. They wanted to ensure that he could never hurt anyone again. Jerome and Denise found some solace in the community's support, but it was a cold comfort. The loss of their daughter and grandchild left a void that could never be filled. They attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row, determined to see Clayton face the full weight of justice. But even a conviction wouldn't bring Monique back. Even seeing Clayton in handcuffs wouldn't heal the wounds left behind. The tragedy that began with Clayton's manipulation had grown into something far larger. A story of betrayal, loss, and broken trust. The community would never forget what had happened, and neither would the families involved. The name Clayton Marshall would forever be associated with pain, with loss, with the lives he had destroyed to protect his own secrets. And as the trial loomed, the town prepared itself for the final chapter, a reckoning long overdue for Monique, for her child, and for everyone whose lives had been shattered by the man they once called Sheriff. The trial of Clayton Marshall gripped the community and the nation, drawing everyone into the dark story of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. Reporters packed the courtroom, cameras perched outside like vultures, ready to capture every moment of the sheriff's downfall. It was not just a trial, it was a reckoning, one that demanded every ugly truth be laid bare for the world to see. From the outset, the prosecution wasted no time laying out their case, presenting a narrative of manipulation that revealed Clayton's true nature. a man who had exploited his authority and preyed on someone who trusted him. Every move he made was calculated, they argued, from the start of the affair to the cold-blooded murder that followed. Clayton Marshall, they said, was not the man the community had thought he was. He was a man who used his badge as a shield to hide his darkest impulses. Piece by piece, the prosecutors reconstructed the events leading up to Monique's death, using surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic evidence to paint a damning picture. They exposed Clayton's efforts to manipulate Monique, convincing her to meet with him under the pretext of mentorship. They explained how he lured her to the remote location, drugged her, and ultimately killed her to protect his reputation and career. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutors described Clayton's actions. Every word felt like a hammer striking the very foundations of trust. Each piece of evidence served as a reminder of the man Clayton had pretended to be and the monster he had become beneath the surface. Then came the emotional testimonies, and with them the heart of the trial was laid bare. Monique's parents, Jerome and Denise Ellis, were the first to take the stand. There was no disguising the grief etched into their faces, nor the weight of the pain they carried as they spoke about the daughter they had lost. Jerome's voice cracked as he recalled the first day Clayton had joined their search for Monique, standing beside him as a trusted friend. "He looked me in the eye," Jerome said, struggling to hold back tears. "He told me we'd find her, and the whole time, he knew exactly where she was." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, the weight of the betrayal too much to bear. Denise's testimony was equally devastating. She spoke about the dreams Monique had for her future, the plans she had shared late at night over cups of tea. "She wanted to make a difference," Denise whispered, her voice trembling. "She wanted to work for the detectives, to protect people. And instead, the man we trusted, our friend, stole her future and buried it in the ground." Her words hung in the air, suffused with the sorrow of a mother who would never see her daughter grow into the woman she was meant to become. As the trial continued, the courtroom was filled with a palpable tension. Every testimony, every exhibit presented brought the harsh truth into sharper focus. But the most shocking testimony came from Clayton's own family. Sharon Marshall, his wife, took the stand with a heavy heart, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "I don't know who my husband is anymore," she admitted. "The man I married, the father of my children, wasn't capable of this, or at least I thought he wasn't." She spoke about the months of lies, the late nights when Clayton returned home with excuses that now felt like insults. "I believed him," she said quietly. "I believed every word, and now I have to live with the fact that I was married to a man I never really knew." Her words landed with the weight of 1,000 betrayals, a wife forced to confront the darkest truth about the man she had shared her life with. Ella Marshall, Clayton's youngest daughter, gave perhaps the most painful testimony of the trial. As she sat in the witness chair, tears streaming down her face, she spoke about the friendship she had shared with Monique and the devastation she felt when the truth came to light. "She was my best friend," Ella said, her voice trembling. "She was like a sister to me. And my father took her away from me." The room fell into silence as Ella's grief poured out, unfiltered and raw. The prosecution pressed further, painting a picture of a man who had not only betrayed his badge, but destroyed 2 families in the process. They described the lengths Clayton went to in order to maintain control, his manipulation of Monique, the lies he told his family, the web of deceit he spun around everyone who trusted him. Finally, it was Clayton's turn to face questioning. The room was still as he took the stand, the weight of his actions pressing down on him from all sides. He had denied the affair at first, denied everything, clinging to the hope that he could somehow escape the consequences. But as the evidence stacked up, it became clear that there was no escape. Under the relentless questioning of the prosecutor, Clayton's defenses began to crumble. His mask of calm authority slipped away, revealing the man beneath. A man consumed by fear, regret, and guilt. At first, his answers were short, clipped as he tried to maintain control. But the prosecutor's questions cut deeper, pushing him to confront the reality of what he had done. "Did you have an affair with Monique Ellis?" the prosecutor asked, his voice steady and unyielding. Clayton hesitated, the weight of the truth suffocating him. He opened his mouth to deny it again, but the words wouldn't come. His shoulders sagged under the crushing burden, and for the first time, he told the truth. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did." The confession sent a ripple through the courtroom. Clayton's family sat frozen in disbelief, while Monique's parents clutched each other, their grief too overwhelming to contain. But the prosecutor wasn't finished. He pressed further, forcing Clayton to confront the full extent of his actions. "And did you kill her?" the prosecutor asked, leaning in closer. "Did you take her life to protect your secret?" Clayton's composure shattered. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them, the weight of his guilt too heavy to bear. "Yes," he choked out. "I killed her. I didn't know what else to do." His sobs filled the courtroom, the sound of a man broken by his own sins. The room sat in stunned silence, the confession hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. There were no more lies to tell, no more masks to wear. Clayton Marshall, once the respected sheriff, had admitted to the unthinkable. The trial was far from over, but the truth had finally come to light. Clayton's confession marked the beginning of the end. An end that would bring justice for Monique and her unborn child, and some semblance of closure to the families whose lives had been shattered. And as the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, one thing was certain. Clayton Marshall's fate was sealed, and there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the weight of justice about to be delivered. Clayton Marshall stood shackled before the judge, his shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of what he had done. But no chains, no bars, could ever truly reflect the gravity of the lives lost at his hands. The life of Monique Ellis, the young woman he betrayed, and the unborn child she carried. This was not just the sentencing of a man. It was the reckoning for 2 lives stolen too soon. The judge cleared his throat, his face solemn as he addressed the courtroom. His words carried the weight of the community's sorrow, the devastation of 2 grieving families, and the shame of betrayal from a man once entrusted with power and responsibility. There would be no easy way to deliver this sentence, for no words could fully capture the harm inflicted by Clayton Marshall. "Mr. Marshall," the judge began, his voice calm but firm, "you have not only committed a grievous crime, but you have also left behind irreparable damage to the lives of those you were sworn to protect. You betrayed a young woman who trusted you, exploited her vulnerability under the guise of mentorship, and in doing so took advantage of your authority in the most despicable way imaginable." The courtroom remained still as the judge's gaze hardened. Monique Ellis was not only a victim of your manipulation. She was a young woman with dreams, ambitions, and a future ahead of her. A future that included the unborn child she carried, a child you helped create, and a child you silenced when you decided to take Monique's life. Gasps rippled through the gallery, the weight of the revelation setting in once again. Monique had carried within her not just the hopes of her parents, but the beginnings of a new life, life that would never see the light of day, all because of Clayton's desperate need to cover his tracks. The judge paused, allowing the gravity of those words to sink in before continuing. The child growing inside Monique was your child, Mr. Marshall. You knew the consequences of that revelation would ruin your career, your reputation, and your family. And in a moment of selfishness and cowardice, you chose to end 2 lives to protect yourself. That choice reflects the depths of your betrayal, not just to Monique, but to your own unborn child. Tears streamed down the faces of Jerome and Denise Ellis as the judge acknowledged their unimaginable loss. They were not only mourning their daughter, but also the grandchild they would never meet. The double loss weighed heavily on them, and the words from the judge only confirmed the depth of Clayton's betrayal. Sharon Marshall clutched her hands tightly in her lap, as if the sheer force of her grip could keep her from shattering completely. Clayton's daughters, Ella and Harper, sat motionless, numb from the revelations that had ripped their family apart. Monique's unborn child would have been their half-sibling, a truth too painful for them to fully comprehend. The judge's voice remained steady, though his expression was one of deep disappointment. The badge you wore, Mr. Marshall, was meant to serve as a symbol of integrity, responsibility, and protection. But you wielded it as a shield to hide your darkest intentions. You manipulated, you betrayed, and you destroyed. This court cannot undo the harm you've caused, nor can it restore the lives you took. But it can ensure that you never again harm another soul. The room held its breath as the judge delivered the sentence. This court finds you guilty of first-degree murder, abuse of authority, and gross misconduct. In light of the severity of these crimes, and the fact that your actions resulted in the deaths of both Monique Ellis and your unborn child, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a final judgment. There would be no reprieve, no chance for redemption. Clayton Marshall's fate was sealed, and he would spend the remainder of his days in a prison cell, haunted by the lives he had taken. The gallery sat in silence as the reality of the sentence set in. Jerome and Denise clung to each other, their grief too overwhelming for words. The child Monique had carried, an innocent life caught in the crossfire of manipulation and betrayal, would never be known, never have a name. And the knowledge of that loss, like a wound that would never heal, would remain with them for the rest of their lives. On the other side of the courtroom, Sharon lowered her head, unable to reconcile the man she had married with the monster now led away in chains. Her daughters, Ella and Harper, sat frozen in their seats, their emotions swirling in a storm of confusion and sorrow. The trial had revealed too much, truths they never wanted to know, burdens they never thought they would carry. As Clayton was escorted from the courtroom, the community watched in silence. They had placed their trust in him, and he had shattered it in the worst way possible. The sentence was justice, but it could never truly heal the scars left behind. Monique and her child were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The judge's final words lingered in the air as the courtroom emptied. "Let this serve as a reminder," he had said, "that power is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. And when that responsibility is betrayed, there are consequences. No one is above the law, and no betrayal will go unanswered." The trial of Clayton Marshall would be remembered not just as the story of one man's fall from grace, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. It was a reminder that authority means nothing without integrity, and that every betrayal, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually come to light. And so, with Clayton sentenced to life without parole, the community was left to pick up the pieces. Justice had been served, but the loss remained, a haunting reminder of the lives stolen too soon, and the trust that could never be restored. Even after the trial ended and Clayton Marshall was locked away, the pain he caused lingered like a shadow over the community. There were no easy answers, no quick resolutions. Monique's death was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning that forced everyone to confront the reality of betrayal hidden behind power and trust. And in the wake of such devastation, healing was slow and uneven, but it had to begin somewhere. For Jerome and Denise Ellis, the loss of their daughter was a wound that would never fully heal.
I think that's more than enough. It still got another 5 minutes of him dragging this thing out. I never heard of this case at all. Sure. I looked something up. I didn't realize this thing was that long until after we started playing it. I said, "Oh,
who sent this?"
I just clicked on it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
We won't do that no more.
Someone
go
you trust.
upstairs, Mike.
Go upstairs. You're right.
Take your water with you.
Yeah, this is a more recent or a better picture of them two. She's beautiful. But golly, how in the world? You look at you. Oh my God. How can you do this? Hey.
That's what we were talking about earlier, isn't it? This goes throughout all. It's not people are talking about CPS and all of that stuff, but this goes deeper, man. This is through all kinds of organizations.
Right. That's probably why I started playing it and stuff. Well,
you want to do your outro?
Y'all, we're gonna get on up out of here. Y'all take it light, take it slow. Tell them Uncle Mike told you so. Peace out.